For a lot of them, I was struck by their age. Most of them were in their late teens, early 20s when they volunteered. Sarnia's youngest World War II fallen soldier was just 17, and almost 1/3 of Sarnia's fallen World War II soldiers were between the ages of 17 and 21. They left behind the comforts of their homes. They left behind their grandparents, their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, their friends. Others left behind girlfriends, wives, and children. First one I'm going to talk about is Bill Cameron. Bill Cameron was born in Plimpton Township. He was an only child. He grew up on Mariah Street, attended skits. He was a well-rounded student and athlete. Those are the principal's comments about him. The principal at skits described him as being a dependable and conscientious student. After graduating, he worked at Imperial for a few months before he enlisted at the age 19. And 1 year later, he had earned his pilot's flying badge. And of the graduating class of 80 students to flying school, 2 were chosen for immediate overseas service, and he was one of them. So he became a member of Bomber Command. And as a 21-year-old, he was piloting a Halifax bomber, the big 4-engine bombers. The Popeye symbol, that was the nickname of his aircraft, and that's on the right there is his actual nose art on his aircraft. In early August 1943, the Sarnia Observer did a story about an air attack against Mannheim, Germany, in which Bill Cameron was piloting one of the Halifax bombers. Another Sarnian named Beverly Scharf, he was 18 years old, he was part of the same crew. And Scharf, who grew up on Cobden Street, had lied about his age to get into the Air Force. Later that month, Cameron's Halifax took off on a night operation. It was Cameron's 19th operation. It was one of over 620 bombers that were targeting Berlin that night. As they approached the target, Scharf would describe it as being flak so thick that you could walk across it. As they approached the target, they were able to evade the enemy night fighters, the flak, the searchlights, and Cameron's Halifax was able to drop their targets on Berlin. As they left the target, they were hit by an enemy fighter. And in the next few chaotic minutes, the flaming aircraft, as it began to plummet to the ground, began to lose control, vibrating badly. Sections of the plane were starting to fall off. Cameron, the pilot, did his best to steady the aircraft and try to hold it for as long as he could, but he ultimately had to give the order to evacuate. A crew member who did bail out reported that Cameron was still fighting the controls to keep the aircraft stable enough for his crew to escape. 3 members of the crew were able to bail out successfully. The other 4 went down with the aircraft, including Cameron. Cameron's parents in Sarnia would receive a telegram that he was reported missing in action. And then several months later, they would receive another telegram informing that he had been promoted to flight sergeant. And so with no further details, quote, his mother's heart would leap every time she heard someone coming to her walk. He was 22 when he died. One of the 3 survivors was the 18-year-old Beverly Scharf on the right there. And he would spend the rest of the war as a POW. After the war, Scharf's mother, Scharf comes back to Sarnia, and Scharf's mother says, you have to go visit the Cameron family, give them some peace of mind, explain what happened. So of course he did that. Years later, he would reflect on his meeting with Mrs. Cameron. This is what he said. She was still hoping against hope. Her son's civilian clothes were hanging in the living room. His photos were everywhere. And sadly, she thought that the silhouette of the young man on her veranda was her son returning. I believe she ultimately died of a broken heart. He was her only child. For Scharf, he would go on to get married, have children and grandchildren. Matter of fact, many years later, one of Scharf's grown-up sons would reflect on Bill Cameron, saying, I don't know what Cameron's dreams were, his hopes or his aspirations, but the heroism of this man saved my father's life. And his story has been told over and over to my children and now my grandchildren. Without Cameron's courage or heroism, my family would not exist. This is Jack Wright. He was born in Petrolia, had just the one sibling, a sister, family moved to Sarnia. So he grew up on Davis Street. He attended Skits High School. After graduating high school, he worked at Imperial Oil for a time while doing a co-op program, because he was also earning his mechanical engineering degree from a college in Detroit. He was in his final year of college when war broke out. So at age 27, he joined the Army. 11 months later, he was overseas in England. He had been promoted to a lieutenant with the Royal Canadian Engineers. The major who evaluated him made comments like, he's proven himself to be a leader, he's very popular, he's highly recommended, and will prove himself to be a most capable officer. Now, Wright was in England during the time of the German Blitz, the nightly indiscriminate bombing of major British cities. At one point, London itself was bombed 57 nights in a row. The Café de Prix was one of the famous landmarks in the city. It was a jazz nightclub frequented by members of high society, even royalty. They listed some of the performers that were famous performers you might recognize that performed there. The Charleston Dance made its initiation there. The interior was modeled after the ocean liner Titanic. It was built in the basement of the theater, so it was considered safe because it was several floors underground. On the night of March 8th, Saturday night, it was a clear night, bright moon. Jack Wright, along with another Sarnian, Jack Clooney, were at the club with a couple of Canadian nursing sisters, both from Toronto. It was the official start of the London social season. Mary Churchill, the daughter of Winston Churchill, was actually on her way to the cafe that same night when the air raid sirens began to wail. A few minutes before 10 o'clock, the dance floor was packed. Jack Wright was on the dance floor with his nursing partner. Their two friends were sitting out the dance because they didn't like that particular song. At about 10 o'clock, 2 German bombs crashed through the roof and onto the dance floor. In the explosion, there was a bright blue flash, cloud of dust, smoke, smell of cordite. In the blackness, objects were hurled in all directions and bodies were sheared apart. Jack Wright's last actions were instinctive and heroic. He shielded his dancing partner by throwing his body across hers, taking the brunt of the blast. Jack Wright was killed as a result. His dancing partner suffered only a hand injury, and in the chaos that followed, his Sarnia friend and the 2 nursing sisters helped to extricate the dad and administer first aid. The other nurse, in her eyewitness account, she said, Lieutenant Wright shielded Miss Stewart, that was the nurse, as soon as he heard the bomb screaming. He died protecting the Canadian nurse. The military papers and London newspapers would write about Jack Wright's heroism in saving the nurse. Jack Wright's only sister in Sarnia would receive a letter detailing her brother's large military funeral in the UK, which was attended by virtually all officers and men from Sarnia who were in the area. This is Gerald Kelly. There's several photos of Gerald Kelly. He was Sarnia born. He was the youngest in a family of 9 children. He grew up on Queen Street, attended Skits. At 17, he left school to help support the family. Remember, 9 kids. So he worked at a local grocery store and then worked at a local machine shop. And at 18 years old, he joined the Army. The Army Examiner said things about Gerald, things like he had lots of energy, he was very cheerful, he had a high degree of self-confidence, appears quite inclined to take the initiative. That will mean something shortly. He was a bright, pleasant lad, and he had leadership ability. Now, Gerald joined the Army despite his parents' wishes. They didn't want him to join, nor did his brothers. 2 of his brothers were serving at the time. That's Gerald on the right, his 3 brothers on the left. But Gerald joined, stating that because of his chums and to do his part to win the war. He was overseas by February 1944, a private with the Algonquin Regiment in the infantry. He would write a lot of letters home about life behind the lines, things like attending regimental dances, playing horseshoes and bingo, bragging about doing his own washing, ironing, sewing. Remember, he's 18. All the money that he earned, he directed home to his mom, telling her, "Mother, I don't want you to save any money for me. Put it in the bank in your name." He would arrive in France in July 1944, 1 month after D-Day. And that summer, The Algonquin Regiment would fight their way east through France in the Battle of Normandy, liberating villages and towns, and then the long left flank, where they continued clearing coastal areas of northern France and Belgium, liberating ports and villages. In a letter he wrote home later that summer, he talked about he hasn't smoked this many cigarettes in his life before, and I can't write this as often as I can, but I'll try as best I can. He went on to describe, he was writing a letter from in a slit trench with a pen that he'd borrowed from someone, ink he'd borrowed from someone else, and paper he'd borrowed from someone else. In the fall of 1944, Gerald found himself with the Algonquins in northern Belgium and Netherlands. The Allies had captured the inland port of Antwerp, Belgium, and Canadians were entrusted with clearing the way to the port. It was a 45-mile-long estuary. The Battle of the Scheldt would be among the most difficult and grueling struggles in the war. The enemy had brought up reinforcements, they mined the area heavily, they flooded areas, and they'd taken up strong defensive positions. One of the early battles of the Scheldt campaign, the Algonquin Regiment was selected to cross a couple of canals, including this one. They were told to cross the channel, dig in, establish a defensive perimeter so that the engineers could build a bridge. The regiment's motto was, "We lead, others follow." On the night of September 13th, 1944, the assault began. The Algonquins successfully crossed the canal. They fought all night long and into the next morning, but as the morning wore on, German reinforcements came up. They were outnumbered, they were low on ammunition, artillery was raining down on them, so they were forced to withdraw. So by noon, the Algonquins withdrew from their position, and that would result in heavy losses. For the Algonquins, it would be the largest single-day loss of the war. There's a memorial there today, marks the spot. Gerald Kelly would lose his life that day, and not long after, his mother would receive a letter from the major of the regiment explaining how Gerald lost his life. And this is a portion of that letter to the mother. It may help you to know that he died a hero's death. Gerald was already at the water obstacle and about ready to enter a boat when it became known that a wounded sergeant who was supposed to have been carried by another party could not be found. Gerald and another sergeant, without being ordered or asked, at once returned through heavy shell and machine gun fire to bring back the wounded party. He was on his return with the sergeant on his back when the shell struck close by, killing him instantly. The other rescuer was wounded, but managed to get back. The Germans would bury the Algonquin dead along with Gerald Kelly, and it would be another 6 weeks before the Allies would capture the enemy ground. Gerald was posthumously awarded a certificate of recommendation that in part read, "He performed outstanding service and shown great devotion to duty," and it was signed by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Early in my research, I came across this photo of a local soldier, William Graham, holding what turned out to be his 1-month-old daughter. The photo was taken in October 1944 here at home. This is after he'd returned from overseas. So he'd been overseas and came back home. He was on a leave and coming back for more training. Along with that photo, I came across this letter that he would write 3 months after this photo was taken. The letter is being written now when he's back overseas. He's back in England, so he's left his baby and his wife. A portion of the letter, he wrote the letter specifically to his daughter, Susan. Here's what part of it says. "My dear little Susan, I wonder, is this the first letter you received? Anyway, I hope you shall be able to write you when you're older. Your father is very proud of you. I must thank you for the beautiful looking package and the photographs that you sent me. Give your love to your mother, Mrs. Graham, your aunt, and of course your grandma." Now, what I would learn that is William on the left there, in fact, had 2 other brothers, and all 3 brothers would serve in the war. The family was originally from Windsor, but they had moved to Sarnia. William was the oldest of the 3. In September 1939, William, the oldest, and Jack, the middle one, would join the army together. They both became members of the Essex Scottish Regiment. So that's Jack on the left. Together, William and Jack would train in Windsor and then they would embark overseas together, and then they would train in England for almost 2 years together. In August 1942, Jack would write a letter home to his parents. In it, he described that they were preparing for a big-scale raid on the French coast. Jack and William would cross the English Channel together. Just before, Jack had again written another letter home in which he told his mom and dad he'd met a certain somebody in England whom he liked very much. For Jack and William, their first day of action was the early morning hours of August 19th, 1942. Days later, the Graham parents in Sarnia would receive news that Jack was missing in the raid, but there was no word on the fate of William. The Dieppe raid, of course, was a disaster for the 5,000 Canadians who were there. And it was not until 4 months after the raid that the Graham parents in Sarnia would receive the happy news that Jack was a prisoner of the Nazis. Jack Graham would spend almost 3 years as a POW. Many years later, he would recall what his experience at Dieppe. He said, "The ramp went down and I found myself crawling over bodies. No training could prepare us for what lay ahead. Carnage was everywhere. It was a massacre." When the war ended, Jack would return to England, and that certain somebody in England met him at the train platform. That somebody was Doris Durrell, and they would eventually get married in England, and then Jack and his war bride Doris would come back to Sarnia. Jack and Doris would have 3 children together, plus grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And for many years, Jack would never speak of the war. And it wasn't until 2004 when one of his great-grandchildren got Jack to finally open up a bit about some of his experience. And Jack went on to speak to school children in classrooms, to church groups, and other interested groups about what his memories of what it was like. And Jack wore a poppy year-round. Now, if I go back to August 1942, just days after the Dieppe raid, what you're looking at is a newspaper clipping from the Sarnia Observer, days after the Dieppe raid. Remember, the 2 boys, William and Jack, landed at Dieppe. And the news story was about Lloyd, the youngest, 19-year-old, joining the war. And he wanted to get into the thick of things. I always think to myself, what would I be doing as a parent right about now? Jack would join the Air Force as opposed to the Army like his brothers. And he was overseas by April 1944, and he was a pilot officer, another member of Bomber Command. Lloyd would be part of a crew flying the 4-engine heavy Lancaster bombers, part of 419 Moose Squadron. He would serve overseas for 8 months. On the night of December 6th, 7th, his Lancaster took off for an operation to bomb a target in Germany. It was in horrible weather, freezing conditions. There was severe icing, and over 450 bombers took part in this raid. After takeoff, Lloyd's Lancaster was not heard from again, and it failed to return to base. The parents in Sarnia would receive a telegram not long after telling them that the aircraft was missing overseas after an operational flight. And a little later, they would get a letter from the squadron commander that told them there's still a possibility that all or part of the crew may be prisoners of war. No one ever knew what happened to the aircraft. The aircraft and the 7 bodies were never recovered, never found. So it was not until 2 months after the war ended that the authorities would inform the parents that, for official purposes, Lloyd Graham is presumed dead. Lloyd Graham has no known grave. His name is inscribed on the Runnymede Memorial, along with 20 other Sarnians. Now, if I go back to William Graham, he was the oldest. Remember, he was 21 when he joined with his 19-year-old brother, Jack, part of the Essex Scottish. They trained in England together, and they both fought at Dieppe. For William, he survived Dieppe, and he would return to England unwounded. But even 6 months after the raid, he would write home to his mom, telling her he had difficulty trying to erase Dieppe from my memory, and have lived the raid over again repeatedly in my dreams. In May 1943, William was returned to Canada to receive advanced infantry training and officers training. His commanding officers would speak highly of William, saying things like he's reliable and inspires confidence. He displays excellent qualities of leadership. He's confident while in command, and he's well liked by his platoon. Also, upon returning to Canada, not long after, he married Dorothy Davies, whom he nicknamed Duty. And about 16 months later, they had their baby girl, Susan. It was Christmas Day, 1944, 3 months after the birth of his daughter, that he would have to return back overseas. William would write many letters home to his wife and daughter. Sometimes he wrote every evening. He constantly expressed his love for his wife and daughter, told them not to worry about him, and how much he missed home. This was a letter that he wrote in late February 1945. The location unknown is going to turn out to be someplace somewhere in Germany. A portion of that letter reads, "My darling, I'm afraid my letters are going to be few and far between, dearest. I'm kept pretty busy, but you can bet I'll do my best. I love you, Duty." He went on to explain how he was writing this letter in a ruined house on a rickety table by candlelight, sitting on a box. "How is our Susan? She's quite a young lady, I'll bet. Does she miss her daddy? I certainly miss her. Have I told you that I love you yet, my Duty? Well, I do, my darling, more than you'll ever know. I'll certainly be glad when this is over. It will be so nice to settle down and live peaceful, normal lives again. I adore you, my dear wife. Take care of yourself and Susan. We'll all be together soon. Kiss Susan for me, darling." Now, 6 days after he wrote that letter, in the Hochwald Forest in Germany, while leading his platoon during an attack, he was killed by a mortar bomb. His body was later exhumed and buried in the Netherlands. 4 days after he was killed, a letter from Dodie arrived for William, along with 2 photographs, that of a Christmas tree and the other of their baby daughter, Susan, along with news that their pablum eater, that's what William called her, had learned to roll over in her playpen. And Duty wrote, "I love you with all my heart, and Susan and I will be waiting right here for you." The letter was returned to her, stamped, "Reported deceased." 2 months later, the war in Europe would end. Over 3,000 Sarnia men and women volunteered to serve in World War II. At least 185 of them lost their lives. They're buried in 64 cemeteries around the world, and more than 1/4 of them have no known graves. So that gives you a glimpse of a few of those names that are on the cenotaph. There are many more stories to be told, but for me, it's important that their sacrifices are remembered. That's it.
Thanks very much, Tom. Incredible stories. We'll have a few minutes for Q&A if anyone